Hello and welcome to the World Congress on Statelessness, which this year comes to you from The Hague and which IOHR are the official NGO media sponsor. Today I'm joined by André and Michael Green. They are the coordinators of the project Behind the Wire, which is an award-winning oral and history project documenting the history of men, women and children who have been detained by the Australian government after seeking asylum in Australia. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Tell me the story of Behind the Wire. When was it founded? How did it all begin?
It really started when I was doing some legal work with refugees in Australia, and I was doing interviews with people who were seeking asylum, and I found that people had all these stories they wanted to tell me, but I was really asking them, very narrow legal questions, and so it really came out of a bit of a frustration with the space that people had to tell their more human, complex stories about life in detention. And in particular at that time, in 2014, there was very little detail about what life in immigration detention looked like in Australia. So just started speaking to people outside of that legal framework and having conversations, and then it grew from there into an oral history organisation.
André, tell me about the current situation of asylum seekers in Australia. Tell me why they're detained in the first place. What have they done wrong?
So Australia's had mandatory detention policy of people seeking asylum since the 1990s, and it's a bipartisan policy of both the major governments in Australia. So it's people fleeing conflict and persecution from all places in the world, and on arrival in Australia they're being taken to detention centres. Some are in our capital cities and some are in remote parts of Australia, and some are also offshore in places like Papua New Guinea and Nauru.
Michael, tell me what are the main human rights violations that these poor people are facing on a daily basis?
So it's been a long period of time. It's been nearly 30 years in Australia. And the conditions have changed over that period, and the numbers of people detained have waxed and waned, and the kind of situations they've been held in have changed as well. But often the sorts of things that people talk about, well, there's arbitrary detention, and people talk about being separated from family, not being able to get good health care. Especially in the offshore detentions, at various times there's been pretty substandard accommodation and food, and there's been a number of sort of issues of violence. One of the hardest things for people is the indefinite part of detention. This is something that comes up again and again every time we speak to someone. They're put in a detention centre and have no idea when they're going to be able to leave. And in some ways the sort of like physical circumstances that they're in seem to be less important for people than that feeling of not knowing when it's going to end, and not having any hope that it will end.
We work really closely and slowly with the narrators that choose to participate in our project, and that begins with a long series of interviews and meetings where we make sure that people are aware of what they're embarking on, and that includes for people who are still in the system in some way, whether they're still in detention or their visa status is still uncertain. There are serious legal risks that they could face, and so we have to make sure that people are well aware of what those risks are, but we also want to honour their bravery in wanting to speak out. And so it's this long process of talking to people, gaining their trust, and then throughout the interview process and the editing process, we make sure as much control as possible remains in the hands of the people speaking out. And then at the end of the process, we produce literary short stories, first-person stories about people's experience in detention. And we've also made podcasts, video installations, sound work, and museum exhibitions.
Michael, tell me how you tell the story of these people. How do you engage with them in the first place? What's the process?
Well, I've actually been to one of the offshore detention centres on Nauru Island a couple of times, and through that project, one of the main relationships or stories that I've worked on is with a man, Abdulaziz Mohammed, who's a Sudanese man, and he was held in the immigration detention centre on Manus for 6 years. And we started speaking by voice message. He had a smuggled phone at that time, and there was no signal. He had to kind of hide in his room when he was talking to me, and so we couldn't have a live call, but we sent voice messages back and forth, and it must have been about, I don't know, 5,000 messages we sent one another, and together made that into a podcast called The Messenger, which told kind of the story of his life, but also these years that he had in immigration detention.
As we know, storytelling has been around for generations. People have been sitting around campfires, passing down folklore, telling historical facts. It's been around forever. But now we see that more and more people are responding to visual stories. Do you feel that you can do justice to these incredible stories through the visual medium?
So we shot some of the stories that we collected in very beautiful high definition footage, and people were telling their stories straight to camera. Yeah. And the idea there was for these videos to be exhibited in the Immigration Museum in Melbourne. And we shot them in a way that sort of placed the audience as if you're sitting or standing in front of someone really telling you about their life and about their hopes and dreams, how those hopes and dreams were affected by their time in detention, stories about their resistance to the system as well. And so something about being face to face with someone in those videos, we hope gave Australian audiences an insight that they otherwise wouldn't have, in bridging a kind of distance or a gap that is deliberately created by the policies between Australians and people in detention. Because it's been so long and it's such a hot button issue in Australia, there's certainly an understanding that this is a policy that Australia has. I would say that people who aren't fully engaged in the issue, I doubt that they would have the kind of knowledge that we've gained through this project of sitting down and talking to people at length, because what you find is not just the headlines but really surprising and human details about people, the way they miss their families, the way parents talk about having children in detention and what that feels like to raise a child in a detention centre. I think it's those sorts of details that people perhaps aren't aware of, and that's what we hope Behind the Wire has achieved, is for the people that have engaged with the stories, that they get that sort of insight.
Michael, a lot of the work that you do focuses on the psychological aspect of what's happened to these people, and I know there was a recent report in CNN that said that suicides and self-harm are spiralling out of control with these people. Do you feel that you can tell their story, you can tell the true horror of what they've experienced through your storytelling?
It's really hard to capture the kind of depth of that sort of despair. After the recent election in Australia, there's been a spike in incidents of self-harm or suicide. And it's the kind of accumulation of such a long period of not having hope. But the way we try to work with people is work with people over a long time, and then you can kind of get a sense of them as people and things that are on their mind. And also, one thing that has come across really a lot in our stories is the sense of solidarity between people who are in detention, and the care that they have for one another, and the support that they try to give one another, the people who are struggling. And it's very difficult really to work with the people who are struggling the most, because they're not necessarily in a situation with the energy to be able to engage in that way or make a decision to kind of reveal their situation. So one of the kind of powerful ways, I think, and perhaps empowering ways that despair comes across through our work is in the way people are talking about the care they're showing for their friends. No, it's something anyone can relate to, knowing that there's someone that you care about who's in trouble. Obviously this is a very particular situation, but I think that when you hear that kind of story, it makes a connection for you.
Unbelievably, Australian law doesn't make any distinction between children and adults when it comes to detention. Do you have any stories that you can share with us about the younger generation and what they've suffered?
I think one story that really stuck with me was a young woman named Jamila who was detained as a child in the early 2000s with her family. And one of the things she talked about in her story is actually after being released and growing up during the 2000s in Australia when, as there has been for the last 20 years, a very toxic debate about asylum seekers and detention centres. And she said to us that she for years didn't tell her best friend about her background and how she came to Australia because she felt ashamed of that time. And so I think that to me really said a lot about the ongoing and pernicious effects of the policy on children. I mean, then there's also just a lot of stories which reveal the depth of the trauma of being detained as a child. I think the deprivation of proper education can be debilitating. But I think the flip side of that is speaking with former child detainees, they're also really energetic, resilient young people that we've spoken to as well, and often really creative. And that's been quite a wonderful part of the project, is to meet these creative young people who want to not only speak out about their story but to create beautiful and moving works of art related to their experience.
Australia has come under a lot of criticism because of child detention on the island of Nauru. Now we know they're not there anymore, but do we have any update? Do we know what's happened since then?
So towards the end of last year, I think the last child was brought to Australia. The children who were there, some of them ended up being taken to the US and a lot to Australia. Now in Australia, they're not necessarily free. They're in community detention, and the reason that those children were finally brought to Australia and taken off Nauru was that it was a result of a very long-running campaign by civil society groups and the people in Nauru and Manus themselves, campaigning for that sort of change.
15 million people we know around the globe are currently stateless. Every 10 minutes a child somewhere in the world becomes stateless. Now I know you have a project, an up-and-coming project on this. Tell us more about that.
We're collaborating with the Peter McMillan Centre on Statelessness at the Melbourne Law School, and we're working on a project to explore the possibility of creating an archive of oral histories about statelessness, or about with people affected by statelessness in Australia. And one of the interesting and exciting things about that project is we're really wanting to ask stateless people who become involved in the project what actually is useful for them, what do they want these stories to look like, where should these stories be published, how should they be published to make the most impact in their own communities. And so we're really thinking a lot about how to make this archive something that the various communities that we work with will find useful and enriching.
So the people who are watching at home, the people who are watching us virtually, they will want to know how they can find out more about you, what your up and coming projects are. Tell us what's happening next.
We have a website which is behindthewire.org.au. You can search for the podcast that features Abdulaziz Mohammed. It's called The Messenger, and you can get it through any podcast app. We also have a book called They Cannot Take the Sky. And we have an exhibition of the same name, and that's touring in Australia in some regional parts of Victoria for the first half of next year.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of IOHR TV. Don't forget there's loads more episodes on our website, so do make sure you check those out. For myself, Trish Lynch, and the team, we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.